So this webinar will be recorded and it will be available to watch afterwards on our website and also on our YouTube page. We will be sure to circulate to those who may have to hop off or who may be joining us late. But essentially, this webinar is going to be an informational event to talk about the Rare Cancer Research Foundation's initiative called Pattern.org. And we are going to be having our president of Pattern.org, Barbara Van Hare, as our keynote speaker today. She's going to be giving you guys some informational details all about Pattern, how patients, caregivers, researchers, and organizations can get involved with this initiative. Barbara has been with the Rare Cancer Research Foundation since its founding roughly 10 years ago. And we are so excited to have her share her slide deck with you all. Just a little bit of housekeeping information. Should you all have any questions at all during the webinar or while Barbara is presenting, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A function at the very bottom of your screen. And then during the Q&A portion at the end of our event, we will go over any of the questions that were pre-submitted during our registration or ones that are submitted live. So with that, I will hand it over to Barbara.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us.
You're just on mute.
Can everyone hear me now?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Lauren, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the power of tissue donation through Pattern.org. And as Lauren mentioned, I am the president of Pattern.org. The Rare Cancer Research Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit, and it was actually founded by an ocular melanoma patient who, after he was diagnosed, realized there were lots of barriers preventing progress in research, not only for his rare cancer, but for virtually each and every rare cancer. So he created the organization with the mission to cure rare cancers through strategic investments and innovative collaborations that help facilitate effective research and accelerate deployment of promising therapies. And that's been our mission for the past 10 years. And hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll understand how Pattern.org fits into that mission. As many of you may know, it is taking by far too long for innovation to reach rare cancer patients. And the quotes that you see on this page, we have actually heard from patients, from researchers, and from clinicians. Patients say, I don't want any other patient to go through what I went through. Researchers saying it's too difficult for them to get samples of a particular rare cancer, so they can't even begin to study it. Other patients are saying they've been diagnosed with a rare cancer, and in their cancer, there's no standard of care, so they don't really have options. And clinicians are saying, we really don't know that much about certain rare cancers, in fact, most of them, and therefore, we don't know what treatments to use. And part of the reason the situation is what I just described to you is because there are a lot of barriers impacting progress in rare cancer research. Some of the key ones are there are limited patients at a single institution, which makes sense. These are rare cancers. So there are not that many patients. And when you look at all the medical institutions across the US, not many patients may be at any particular center. Stored tissue, which is tissue that the medical institution will take after surgery, may not be fully utilized. It may be stored in an biobank at an academic institution, and it may or may not be used for research. Researchers that may not be at an institution that has at least some samples of a particular rare cancer, they don't, for the most part, have access to any tissue. So it's hard for them to even study it. Because there's not tissue available, there haven't been models created. And those models are important because that's one of the things that researchers use to learn about the disease and also test drugs against. And even if there is a model or two or three, Usually they're not in a public repository where other researchers can access them. Furthermore, until pattern.org, in many cases, there wasn't the infrastructure to get tissues to researchers that needed it, much less funding to do the work. So RCRF launched Pattern to overcome these barriers by enabling patients to directly donate their tissue and medical data to high-impact research that need those tissues. And those patients can donate regardless of where they're being treated. So at any institution in the United States, and by the end of this year, we also plan to be collecting tissues from Canada. In a nutshell, Pattern bridges the gap between patients and scientists, empowering the patients to be partners in this critical research and helping to prove outcomes. So how does Pattern work? First step is patients learn about research studies for their particular disease. They go to pattern.org, they put in some basic information, and then they're matched to a study that are in need of that particular tissue, and then they're able to consent online. Once a patient consents online, the Pattern team is immediately notified and starts to coordinate the transfer of that tissue and data. And I'll explain in more detail how this process works. So first of all, how do patients find out about Pattern? Well, we would partner with over 200 different disease foundations and advocacy groups so that we can reach diverse rare cancer populations. Listed on this slide is just a few of the many foundations that we work with. And we work across all different rare cancer types and even with uncommon subtypes of common cancers. We and our advocacy partners utilize social media, websites, webinars like this, conferences, and word of mouth to connect with patients. Here are just some examples of the type of flyers and social media posts and web information that talk about Pattern. And we'll work closely with our advocacy partners if there's particular wording or changes that we need to make to help them reach their patient communities. How does the consent actually work? Once a patient learns about Pattern, when they go to the site, what exactly needs to happen? So I'm going to show you a short video that encompasses the basics of Pattern.
Thanks for visiting pattern.org. This video will show you what's involved in donating your tumor tissue to researchers. There are 4 steps in the enrollment process, which should take less than 10 minutes to complete. There's no cost to participate. Before you begin, it may be helpful to gather contact information for your surgeon and oncologist. You'll need it later. We'll start on the front page of pattern.org. To begin, click on any of the big green buttons, like the one that says Get Started at the top of the page. This will take you to the personal information section. We collect this information so we can confirm your eligibility to participate, match you with the appropriate study or studies for your indication, and contact you if we have questions. Enter your basic contact info, select your diagnosis, and tell us if you have a surgery or biopsy planned. When you're done, you should see the Save and Continue button turn blue. Click it to start on the next step. Pattern.org uses your indication to match you with studies and projects from some of the most cutting-edge institutions in the United States. Take a moment to read the study description. When you're ready to continue, click the button at the bottom of the study. Each study has its own consent document, which explains the study's goals, procedures, and extent of your involvement in detail. Read through each subsection, then click the green button at the bottom to continue. If you have questions, there are ways to contact us at the bottom of each page. On the last page, you will electronically sign the consent with your full name and birth date. The last step is the donation information page. Here, you'll tell us more about your procedure and doctors so we can coordinate your tissue donation. We'll reach out to care providers to explain your participation in the study. There won't be any change in your treatment or procedure. Once you click Submit, you're done. The following pages give you more information about the study and your account. If you have any questions, we're always happy to help. Click the round green button to live chat during normal business hours, or send us an email to info@pattern.org. Thanks for
So patients can consent to give living viable tissue from anywhere in the US. So wherever the patient is being seen, whether it's an academic center, whether it's a regional or community hospital, we will then, after a patient consents, we'll reach out to their clinical team, whether that be their surgeon, their oncologist. Most likely, we may also talk to the pathologist that'll be involved in their case to tell them about the study, to tell them what the process will be, that we will overnight the kit with everything that they need. We'll include the instructions, be there to answer any questions by phone if they have them during the procedure. And then we will ship the kit, and they will, in many cases, talk to the patient prior to surgery to make sure that the patient has agreed to the study. But we will also send a copy of the consent so that you're covered in case the doctor doesn't ask. That's not necessary for a patient to talk to the doctor about the study unless they want to. We're more than happy if a patient wants to bring it up to their doctor, but it's not required. One key change from our study and others is that we are collecting living viable tissue, primarily from surgeries, but also from fluid drains. A lot of studies will collect stored tissue that's been put like in paraffin, but we work directly with the surgeon and the other staff at the hospital to collect that living tissue, and we'll show why in the next few slides. So what do we actually collect from the hospital? If it is a solid tumor, we ask to collect about 0.5 cubic centimeters of tissue. We can accept less if it's a smaller tumor. Always happy to accept more because the researchers always would like to have more for their studies, but we'll work with whatever excess tissue is available from the surgery. We also can collect fluid from drains. A number of different cancers have late-stage patients that may have buildup of fluid. So for a lot of the cancers, we can collect from the drain fluid up to 500 milliliter of fluid. We also will collect either a small bit of normal tissue and or blood so that there is a germline sample so they can compare the germline to the tumor sample. If the normal tissue or blood is not available, or the patient doesn't want to donate any normal tissue or blood, we can collect saliva. And then we'll also collect clinical data, i.e. medical records. We utilize custom designed tissue shipping kits with special nanocool technology to make sure that the tissue stays at the correct temperature, and also so it's easy for the institution to collect the tissue. We include everything that's necessary in this collection kit, and all the surgeon or pathologist or whoever at the hospital will be responsible can just place the blood and or tumor tissue or normal tissue into the kit, and then it is overnighted to the lab that it's designated to go to. So just to clarify what's Pattern's role versus a partner research foundation. On the left-hand side is the area that Pattern covers. We work with the patient consent and the tissue donation and actually do the tissue collection and the data collection. The labs that we work with are the ones that develop models and do genomic sequencing, and they also publish and make accessible the data and the models that they generate. For the general research studies that we support, which is the studies that we're supporting today, all of the data is de-identified and is made available. In order for a lab to work with us, it's a requirement that they share that data so it goes in the public domain so that other researchers worldwide will have access to that. Today, where does the collected tissue go? We're currently working with 5 different institutions: the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, MD Anderson, Emory University, and specifically the Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, the Koch Institute at MIT, and University of Wisconsin Health, but we're in discussions with 12 other labs. Most likely there will be another 3 or 4 onboarded within the next 2 months, and then others by the end of the year. Our partner labs help reveal, if you'll see in quotes, patterns in cancer, so that there's a better understanding of these rare cancers and hopefully will aid in the development of novel therapies. We're often asked where pattern.org comes from, and basically it's so these researchers can find those necessary patterns so they can learn more about the disease and learn how to treat them. The key lab work that is done involves cancer model generation in creating either cell lines or organoids. Cell lines are 2D models, organoids are 3D models, or animal models, also known as PDX models. They also do genomic sequencing, and as of late, there's a very large interest in spatial genomics, also known as single cell sequencing, so they can more fully understand what's going on in each cell. They do CRISPR screens, which basically helps them understand the role of different genes and their functions, as well as drug screens. Key points when donating tissue through Pattern for general research. We're utilizing fresh tissue from surgical resections or fluid drains. It is excess tissue only. And excess tissue means it is not tissue that's going to be needed for your care. If there is a patient with a small tumor and all of that, or even a large tumor, and all of that tissue is needed for the patient care, we tell the institution not to send any to us. We only want tissue that is currently not needed for that patient care. This project will not affect clinical care at all. And for model generations, biopsies normally don't provide enough tissue. So normally we like to stay with just getting the tissue from surgical resections or fluid drains. You must consent prior to the surgery. Once the tissue is removed from the body, normally fairly quickly, within an hour or two, most of that tissue is put in paraffin, and that doesn't make it viable for the type of studies that we are supporting at this time. So we would ask, if possible, that a patient consent at least a week in advance in order for us to have the best chance of collection, because there's a lot of coordination that needs to be done at the institution where that patient is being seen in order for us to get their approval to receive the tissue and to get the kit shipped to them. However, if a patient learns about Pattern even a day before their surgery, we will do our best to try to get that tissue if the patient has consented. We do protect patient privacy. Right now for our general research studies, all the tissue and data is de-identified before it goes to a lab, and all the data is stored on an encrypted HIPAA-compliant data server with restricted access. A patient can revoke consent at any time, and there is no cost to the patient to participate. So why are we doing this work? To date, the work through Pattern has already led to the development of 58 new research models. These are models that were not available before, weren't created before, and in a number of cases, it has led to the development of the first ever publicly available cell lines. There are 2 desmoid tumor cell lines that are currently at ATCC, which is a public biorepository that were created based upon tissue through Pattern. It's enabled new research on more than 55 types of rare cancer. There have now been CRISPR, drug screens, and single cell sequencing on a lot of quote unquote new rare cancers that may not have had any of those screens done before. And we are now rapidly scaling to support an increased amount of tissue donations from any patient at any hospital in the US and soon to be Canada. And thereby we're enabling donations from diverse, and underserved populations. Overall, rare cancer patients are an underserved population just because of the lack of research overall in the past. So we're serving the rare cancer community and also minorities that may be part of that community. The RCRF is developing a fiercely patient-centric ecosystem to improve rare cancer research for the benefit of all. So we're not content. Pattern is a wonderful platform. It has already led to the creation of new models and new research and new data, but we aren't content to just remain doing what we're doing. We want to do that and more. So in the near future, Pattern.org patients and their doctors will be able to access genomic data from their samples to help better inform their care. So what we like to say is historically, Pattern has been a one-way highway, and we're so appreciative of the patients have donated their tissue that's gone to general research. Basically, they have known that the tissue's gone to research in hopes that it will help future patients not have to go through what they have and help expedite the race for cures for their cancers. But within the next few months, we'll be announcing an initiative where we'll be able to have genomic data from these patient samples. We'll have a webinar and other information available to explain how this will work. And that data will be sent to a CLIA lab. The tissue will be sent to a CLIA lab where data will be generated along with a report that will help patients access tumor profiling and in the longer term, insights from patients with similar genomic profiles and from across our patient community. So we'll be excited to announce all of this within the next few months so that our patients now can actually benefit from what we will call the second lane of the highway, so that we're able to actually give something back to the patient to help inform their care. Patients have the power to make a difference. Researchers are in desperate need of this very valuable tissue, and we so appreciate everyone that has donated to date. But we would also ask you or others that you may know to consider donating tissue through Pattern if you have an upcoming surgery or fluid drain. And if you would be willing to spread the word to other rare cancer patients or caregivers, we would really appreciate your help so that we all together can further critical and promising research. We've been asked by a number of folks about if they're not having a surgery or they don't have a fluid drain, how else can they support rare cancer research? You can go to our website. Can't really see it very well here, but rarecancer.org/ways to help in order to learn other ways that you can support our work. Now I'll turn it over for Q&A, Lauren, that either came through prior to or during this webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Barbara. And thank you everyone who has listened in and joined us for this afternoon's call. We've received a numerous amount of wonderful questions, so we're going to do our best to try to answer as many as we can. This webinar was initially scheduled to be about 30 minutes, but we are going to run a little bit over just so that we can spend some time going through some of those questions, because I know that those are really important to be and have those be answered. So let's get to it. The very first question we received from an attendee was, I'm consenting to give my tissue to the hospital where I'm having surgery, and they say it will be used for research. Is there a need for me to also consent to Pattern.org?
We would really appreciate that you would consider donating through Pattern.org. Depending on the institution, when they bank your tissue, in most cases, particularly academic centers will bank the tissue. It may or may not be used for research in the near future or even in the long term. Many institutions will bank that tissue in hopes that they'll have research on that cancer at some point. it's a great thing to give tissue to your institution. However, if there is excess tissue available, donating through Pattern means that we will send it to a lab who is dedicated to working with your type of cancer and utilizing it in research studies in the short term so that they can generate data and learnings to help that patient community and other rare cancer patient communities. If for some reason there isn't enough tissue and that the institution needs all of the tissue that they have procured from your surgery, then of course there's not tissue for Pattern, and that is fine. We are perfectly okay for that. We want to make sure tissue that's needed for your care is there. In quite a few cases, the majority of cases, usually there is a small amount of tissue that they can send, but we totally understand if there's not enough.
Great. And that leads me into my follow-up. What do you mean by excess tissue?
So excess tissue means that they are not taking excess tissue out of your body that doesn't need to come, that this is from the tissue that they have procured from your surgery, and it is not needed for your current care or anticipated needed for your future care. Usually institutions will keep some tissue in case you need it for future studies. If your doctor has any concerns about the amount of tissue that may be available, we work with them on that. And again, we totally understand if really there isn't enough tissue to share. And if there isn't enough tissue to go to us, we will make sure that you, the patient, is aware of that post-surgery.
Thank you. Next question. What else do I need to do after I consent on pattern.org? Do I need to talk to my surgeon about my desire to have the tissue sent through pattern.org?
We always appreciate it when a patient wants to talk to their clinician about it, but it is not required. We will reach out to the surgeon. We will tell them about the study. We will send them a copy of the consent. We'll also send them the protocol for the study if they're interested. And we will work with them closely, but a patient should feel free to talk to their clinician if they are so inclined.
Wonderful, thanks. What if my cancer type isn't listed on the pattern.org website?
If you're on Pattern and it's not listed, please utilize the chat function on pattern.org. That's the little pop-up that's on, I think, the bottom right, where you can send us a note or you can email us at info@pattern.org, and we will get back to you. It may be an oversight on our part, or it may be it's listed a different way, but we are glad to accommodate any new rare cancers that we're not aware of. We do have some studies that are willing to take any rare cancer that we're able to obtain.
Thank you. Next question. Who owns patient tissue samples?
That is a really good question. Our view would be a patient should own their tissue. A lot of institutions, and one of the barriers that have prevented rare cancer research from moving forward, feel that as soon as the tissue is removed from the patient, that it is the property of the institution. That has caused a number of patients who have come to us concerned because in a number of cases, they aren't even able to get their tissue that may be stored there out for studies they want to support. So by consenting through Pattern prior to surgery, we have a better chance of being able to get that tissue because the patient is making their wishes known before the surgeon actually removes the tissue. In a number of regional and community hospitals, many of them do not store or bank tissue. So in those cases, they only keep what's needed for the patient care and literally discard the rest. So versus discarding that tissue, that is definitely considered excess tissue. That tissue would go to a research lab.
Awesome. Thank you. Another question, what motivated you to work for / support this cause?
Well, I can talk about my experience personally. I had a father back in the late 1950s that was diagnosed with mouth cancer. I have a brother that was diagnosed with glioblastoma multiforme, which is the deadliest form of brain cancer, which is a rare cancer. And I have another relative with a rare eye cancer. So rare cancers have been around me virtually my whole life, and wanted to get engaged in the cause, not just to help my family, but to help others like them. And there are literally hundreds of thousands of rare cancer patients each year, and wanted to do my part to help break down the barriers that are preventing that research. And I think I can speak for the other members of the RCRF and Pattern team. Each and every one of them either has had a rare cancer diagnosed, or a loved one or a friend with a rare cancer diagnosis. And so they are also very, very committed to the cause.
So another question we received is, what if I mention this to my doctor and they have concerns about giving too much tissue away? And I know that you kind of touched on this, but if you wanted to elaborate at all, feel free.
Okay, yeah, and we get this question actually quite a lot, and we will work with the clinician. And truly, if he feels there is not going to be enough tissue, again, that is great. Patients come first. Everything we do is patient-centric. So we want to make sure that the clinical care team has everything that they need to do the best they can for that patient. So they may tell us up front not to send a kit, or they may say send a kit, and if there is excess tissue, we're glad to support the initiative. So we'll work with them, and again, we'll get back to the patient if there are any challenges along the way, or if they tell us it is, there's just no way there's going to be enough tissue. Again, that's fine. We fully support that. If that's in the best interest of the patient.
So we received 2 questions live after your presentation. One of them is, when I go to pattern.org, the green button directs me to the surgery / fluid drain donation eligibility. Is that the only sample collection study happening at this time? So I think maybe you might want to just explain that a little bit further.
Okay, if I understand the question correctly. So Pattern right now is utilized to collect surgical tissue as well as fluid tissue. So living tissue that can be sent to research projects that will use them to either generate models or some of like the single cell sequencing and other things. So all of our studies currently fall under that. There will be new initiatives coming on board, one being this CLIA testing on tumor tissue in order to do genomic sequencing that technically doesn't require surgery, but we'll be doing it for Pattern patients. So if someone isn't currently scheduled for a surgery or isn't planning a surgery within the next 6 months, technically right now, there's not an opportunity for them to participate in Pattern in terms of being a tissue donor. Does that make sense? Or do I need to try to?
No, that makes sense. And I think that helps answer, because she did have a second part to her question. She had said that she has already had surgery and does not have live tissue samples at the moment, but she's looking to actively help out in any studies, as she's never met anyone with the same type of cancer in the same location as a young adult. So she was wanting to see if there were any ways that she could help out, or is there anything that she can do to use her current existing samples?
That's a great question. Currently, Pattern isn't collecting stored tissue for research studies, but that could change. So I'd ask that patient or any other patients to email us at info@pattern.org to see if we do have any studies coming down the pike that might be able to use that tissue. And or if there are other initiatives that we are aware of, because there are quite a few that we are aware of that do use stored tissue, or partner projects that we might be able to link them to.
Great, thanks. Another question we received is, how do you determine which institution receives the patient's tissue?
That's also a really good question. Historically, most of the cancers that we've dealt with, different institutions were interested in specific ones based upon either their researchers' interest and expertise and or funding that they had received to study a tissue. As we've gotten larger, we're starting to see multiple institutions interested in the same tissue. So we work closely with experts in the field, many that are associated with our partner foundations, as well as researchers that we know that aren't particularly tied to any particular foundation or group, to get their advice based upon the studies on how we should divide the tissue, whether we can send it to one, send it to both. Maybe the first few samples go to one project, the next samples go to another. All of the researchers that we work with are doing innovative things with the tissue, but we will rely on experts that we have within the foundation, our foundation, as well as outside of our foundation to help us make those choices. I will tell you that a number of times we have discussed the option of giving patients the opportunity to decide where their tissue should go to which study. And somewhat surprisingly to me, virtually every foundation partner we've talked to has suggested that we don't do that because the patients have so much going on prior to their surgeries that they strongly suggest that we retain the right to determine where it should go based upon all of these different experts telling us their recommendations.
So we have time for 2 more questions. We've received numerous amounts, and I will make note that some questions might be more appropriate for us to answer offline. We did receive a few clinical questions when folks registered, so we're unable to answer those currently as time persists, but please know that we appreciate those submissions and we'll answer you directly since we have your email address, and we will put you in contact with someone that might be better equipped to answer those. So 2 more questions. One being, do I have to have an imminent procedure scheduled, or should I just register in general so that part is done?
You can go ahead and register, and one of our team members will reach out to you to give an idea of, just to talk to you about, if you think you might have a surgery in 8 months or in a year, and we can check back with you periodically if that's okay with you. We don't want to be cumbersome to you or bother you, but you can feel free to go ahead and sign up, and then we'll just keep you on file and regularly check in with you every few months if that's okay with you.
Awesome. And then the last one is, will all institutions participating in this program make the information they gain from samples available on a public platform available to researchers everywhere?
Absolutely. One of the requirements, they have to sign an agreement with us that if they accept tumor tissues through us, they have to agree to put it in the public domain. So any models would go into most likely a public biorepository such as ATCC, which is in Manassas, Virginia. There is also a public biorepository over in Germany that literally researchers anywhere in the world can access those. Same with the data sets. We have had actually recently, earlier this week, an agreement came back from one of the institutions that wants to work with us, and they wanted to change it so that the researcher didn't have to share the data or models until after they published on it. And that is not acceptable. That is one of the challenges and the barriers in getting research moving faster. So they need to share it as soon as possible, and not wait what can take 4 or 5 years for a publication to come out.
Thank you. Again, we wish we could answer all of your questions. Some of them we will answer offline directly. Thank you to all of those submissions and for the folks that send in questions during their registration. On behalf of Barbara and I, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you to Barbara for her time and presentation. And should you have questions, please feel free to email us at info@pattern.org. These are the links to our website, pattern.org and rarecancer.org. And I will let Barbara, if she has a last wrap up.
Yes, thank you for all for participating today. We will be in touch, having more webinars through the summer and this fall as we're announcing new initiatives. So we're excited to share with you the work we're doing and the results that are coming through the selfless donation of patients. We're working here with you and with patient advocates, researchers, and across the board to try to make the system more efficient, so that everyone can lead longer, healthier lives. So thank you today and for your participation.
Thank you, everyone.